She is still smiling at me, right now, across this dinner table. My daughter-in-law Sandra believes she has already won. The candles are flickering between us. The wine is poured. My son Daniel is sitting to her left with the expression of a man counting down the minutes. My granddaughter Lily is drawing something on a napkin with a green crayon, completely unaware that this family is about to change forever tonight. Sandra reaches across the table and touches my hand. She says, "Harold, you seem quiet. Are you feeling okay?" I tell her I'm fine, sweetheart, just a little tired. She smiles. That smile, the one I have spent 3 years watching, and only 4 months truly understanding. It is the smile of someone who believes the hardest part is already done. On the chair beside me, there is a manila envelope. Sandra has looked at it 7 times since we sat down. I counted every single one. She thinks it contains the signed documents she has been waiting for. She thinks that after dessert, I am going to slide it across this table, squeeze my son's shoulder, and quietly disappear from everything I spent 41 years building. What Sandra does not know is what is actually inside that envelope. What she does not know is that I spent the last 90 days not forgetting things, but documenting them. What she does not know is that 2 vehicles have been parked on this street since 6 in the evening, and the men inside them are waiting for a single text message from my phone. She raises her glass toward me. I raise mine back. I smile. I have become very good at smiling. But in 20 minutes, when Sandra opens that envelope at this table in front of my son and my granddaughter, everything she has built on top of my life is going to collapse. To understand why, we need to go back 41 years. My name is Harold Mercer. I am 67 years old, and I've spent the better part of my life doing one thing with any real consistency. Working, not the kind of working that stops at 5 in the afternoon and resumes at 9 the next morning. The kind that follows you home, sits at the dinner table with you, and keeps you awake at 3 in the morning running numbers in your head that nobody else in the house understands. The kind that costs you something every single day and asks for more the next. I started Mercer Cold Chain in 1983, 1 refrigerated truck, a handshake agreement with a regional seafood distributor out of Baltimore, and a loan that took me 11 years to fully repay. Cold chain logistics means moving perishable goods, food, medicine, temperature-sensitive cargo, from one point to another without ever breaking the controlled environment that keeps those products safe. It sounds technical because it is. It is also brutally unforgiving. One mechanical failure, one driver who leaves a cargo door open too long, one miscalculation in routing during a summer heat wave, and you are liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in spoiled product. I learned that lesson in my 2nd year. I never forgot it. By the time I turned 50, Mercer Cold Chain had 92 refrigerated trucks operating across 11 states, contracts with 3 of the largest pharmaceutical distributors on the East Coast, annual revenue that had crossed $30 million. I had built it from nothing, from a loan I could barely afford, and a truck I maintained myself in a rented garage in Dundalk, Maryland. Every driver I hired, I interviewed personally. Every contract I signed, I read twice. Every expansion decision I made, I lost sleep over before committing. That company was not just a business. It was proof. Proof that a man with no college degree, no family money, and no connections could build something real if he refused to stop. My wife Carol understood that better than anyone. We married in 1981 when I was 23 and she was 21, and neither of us had anything worth mentioning. She worked as a medical receptionist for the first 12 years of our marriage while I built the business. She never once complained about the hours, or the stress, or the vacations we never took. She raised our son Daniel through the years when I was more absent than present. and she did it with a patience and a grace that I am still not sure I deserved. Carol passed away from ovarian cancer 6 years ago. There is not a morning I wake up that I do not feel the specific weight of that absence. Daniel is our only child. He is 38 years old, and from the time he was a teenager, he had an instinct for operations, for systems, for the logic of how things move from one place to another, efficiently. I put him through a logistics and supply chain program at Penn State. When he graduated, I brought him into Mercer Cold Chain, starting in dispatch, the same way I had learned, from the ground up. By the time he was 32, he was running our mid-Atlantic operations, and doing it well. I was proud of him in the way that only a father who has built something with his own hands can be proud of a son who understands what that something actually is. He met Sandra at an industry conference in Philadelphia 4 years ago. She was working in corporate acquisitions for a private equity firm that specialized in logistics and supply chain companies. She was 31, sharp, well-dressed, and spoke about business valuation with a fluency that I genuinely respected. When Daniel brought her home the first time, I remember thinking, this is a woman who understands what it took to build this. I thought that was a good thing. I thought her interest in the business was the interest of someone who valued what we had created. It took me a long time to understand the difference between someone who values what you have built and someone who wants to own it. The first year was fine. Sandra came to family dinners. She asked smart questions about our pharmaceutical contracts and our fleet maintenance schedules. She had a warmth that felt genuine, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Daniel seemed happier than I had ever seen him. When they got married 2 years after they met, I stood at that ceremony and felt something close to complete. Carol would have loved her, that is what I remember thinking. Carol would have loved Sandra. I held on to that thought for a long time. After everything else started to fall apart, the first sign came 18 months ago, and I almost missed it entirely. Daniel came into my office on a Tuesday morning and sat down across from my desk with the posture of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. He told me that Sandra had been looking at our corporate structure and felt we were exposed in ways that a simple reorganization could fix. He said she thought we should bring in an outside advisor, evaluate whether the business was optimally structured for a generational transfer of ownership. I said, Daniel, I am 66 years old. I am not planning my funeral. He smiled and said, Dad, it is just smart planning. Sandra knows this world. This is what she does. I told him I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it, but Sandra did not drop it. 2 weeks later, she called me herself. Her voice was warm and measured, the voice of someone who has made difficult calls before and knows how to soften the edges. She said, Harold, I hope Daniel mentioned what we talked about. I just want you to know it comes from a place of genuine care. You have built something extraordinary, and we just want to make sure it is protected. The word protected landed on me in a way I could not immediately explain. Protected from what? I asked. She said, from probate, from tax exposure, from operational uncertainty if something were to happen to you unexpectedly. I said, Sandra, nothing is going to happen to me unexpectedly. She laughed softly and said, of course not. I just want us to be prepared. We want to be prepared. I noticed after that call that Sandra had started saying we in a very specific way. Not we as in Daniel and I, but we as in the people who are going to be running this company. It was subtle enough that I might have imagined it. But I have spent 41 years in business, and subtlety is something I have learned to pay very close attention to. I started paying attention. 3 months after that conversation, I found something I was not looking for. I was reviewing a quarterly operations report when I noticed a line item I did not recognize. A consulting fee, $42,000, paid to a firm called Sentinel Advisory Group. I had not approved any consulting engagement. I had not been told about any consulting engagement. So I called our comptroller, Patricia, a woman who had worked for Mercer Cold Chain for 16 years. I asked her about the payment. She said, "Mr. Mercer, Daniel authorized it. He said you had approved bringing in outside expertise to evaluate the company's ownership structure." My stomach went cold. I had approved nothing. When I brought it up with Daniel, he did not flinch. He said, "Dad, we talked about this in September, after the board dinner. You said it sounded reasonable." I sat with that for a moment. I could not remember that conversation, not even a fragment of it, and that terrified me in a way the missing $42,000 did not. Because there is nothing more disorienting than a confident, specific account of something you have no memory of. I started to wonder if I was losing my grip. I started to wonder if the stress of running the company alone since Carol died had finally caught up with me in some way I could not see clearly from the inside. That night, I sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. I made myself go back through every conversation I had with Daniel in September. I wrote them down. I checked my calendar. I checked my emails. There was nothing. No mention of Sentinel Advisory Group. No approval of any consulting contract. The conversation Daniel had described with such calm certainty had never happened. And once I understood that, once I accepted that my son had looked me in the eye and described a memory I could not have because it did not exist, something shifted permanently in the way I saw what was happening around me. I did not say another word about it to Daniel or to Sandra. I went back to work the next morning. I smiled. I asked about the fleet reports. I talked about the new pharmaceutical contract we were finalizing in Charlotte, but inside, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront anyone. I was not going to accuse anyone of anything. I was going to watch. I was going to document, and I was going to find out exactly how deep this went. Before I made a single move that would tell them I was no longer the confused old man they were counting on me to be. The first thing I did was hire someone who had no connection to Mercer Cold Chain, no reason to be loyal to anyone, except what the numbers actually said. His name was Frank Delgado, a forensic accountant I found through my personal attorney, a man named George Patton, who had handled my legal affairs for 30 years. I did not tell Patricia at the office. I did not tell anyone who worked for me. I paid Frank out of a personal account that Carol and I had opened together in 1987, an account that existed in no document Sandra had ever seen. I gave Frank 2 years of financial records and told him to find anything that did not belong. He called me 18 days later and asked me to meet him somewhere private. We met at a diner on Route 40, a place I used to stop at when I was still driving my own truck in the early years. I'd eaten breakfast at that counter dozens of times as a young man with grease under his fingernails, and a loan payment coming up in 3 weeks, and the specific clarifying terror of someone who cannot afford to fail. I arrived first, ordered coffee, sat in a corner booth by the window, and I want to be honest about something I have not said out loud to many people. In those weeks between hiring Frank and meeting him at that diner, I had genuinely started to wonder if I was the problem. Daniel had described those forgotten conversations with such specific, calm certainty that some part of me had begun to absorb it. I had started checking my own memory the way you check a wall for cracks, looking for evidence that the structure was compromised. Some mornings, the first thought in my head before anything else was, what if they are right about me? That is what sustained, deliberate gaslighting does to a person. It does not just make you angry, it hollows out the ground beneath your own feet. Frank came in and sat across from me without any pleasantries, because Frank is not that kind of man, and that is exactly why I hired him. He opened his folder and slid a summary sheet across the table and watched my face while I read it. The number at the bottom was $314,000. Questionable transactions across 22 months, 11 payments to companies that dissolved under any serious examination, shell entities with professional-looking websites, and no verifiable operations, no employees, no physical address that led anywhere real. Sentinel Advisory Group was one of them. Frank said, "Harold, every single one of these payments was structured to stay just below your internal authorization threshold. Not occasionally, not most of the time. Every single time, without exception. Someone who understood your approval process from the inside built this specifically to avoid your signature on anything." I asked him if he could trace where the money had gone after it left our accounts. He pulled out a second sheet. 2 of the receiving entities shared a registered agent address in Wilmington, with a holding company incorporated in Delaware 19 months ago. The holding company was called DM Capital Holdings. I looked at those 2 letters for a long time, then I folded the sheet, put it in my jacket pocket, finished my coffee, and drove home without saying much else. The 2 weeks after that meeting were the hardest of the entire 4 months, not because of the anger, though the anger was real. The hardest part was continuing to go to work every day and sit across from my son and perform normalcy convincingly enough that he had no reason to become careful. I would walk into my office in the morning, and Daniel would be there with his coffee and his easy smile. And I would answer him the way I always had, and then spend the rest of that day carrying Frank's summary sheet in my jacket pocket like a stone I could not put down. The call that changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with came on a Tuesday morning in late February. It was from Christine, my daughter from my first marriage, 42 years old, lives in Annapolis, works as a corporate communications consultant. Christine and I had found our way back to each other in the last decade after years of the complicated distance that blended families sometimes create. When her name appeared on my phone that Tuesday morning, I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Her voice stopped me completely. She said, "Dad, I need to see you. And I need you to promise me you will not tell Daniel I called." I said, "Christine, tell me what is happening." She said, "I cannot do it on the phone, please. Can I come to the house? I need to show you something. I have been trying to decide whether to tell you for 3 weeks, and I cannot keep it to myself anymore." I said, "Come tomorrow morning at 9. She said, "Okay." Then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry I waited this long." I asked her what she was sorry for. She said, "You will understand when you see it." I did not sleep that night. I sat in my office until 2 in the morning, going through Frank's report, trying to imagine what Christine could have that was separate from what I already knew. By the time I finally went to bed, I had almost convinced myself it would be something peripheral, something that confirmed what I knew without adding anything essential. I was wrong about that. In a way, I was not prepared for. Christine arrived at 9 with her laptop bag over her shoulder and dark circles under her eyes. She sat down at the kitchen table and she hugged me first. A long hug, the kind we had not exchanged in years. When she pulled back, her eyes were full, and her chin was doing the thing it used to do when she was a little girl, trying not to cry in front of people. She opened her laptop and she said, "Dad, 6 weeks ago, Sandra called me out of nowhere. She said it was a friendly call, just catching up," which I found strange immediately, because Sandra and I have always been polite with each other in the way people are polite when they share a family but genuinely have nothing in common. Sandra asked about my work, asked if I was still doing corporate communications consulting. Christine said yes. Sandra asked if she would be willing to take on a small freelance project, something discreet. She would pay her well, and she just needed Christine to keep it between them. She said it was a surprise she was planning for Daniel. Christine turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was an email chain. Sandra's original brief was attached as a document, and I read it with the specific focused attention of someone who has learned to read carefully because the cost of missing something is too high. Sandra had asked Christine to write a 4-page personal narrative document in my voice, first person, my words, describing my own cognitive decline over the past 2 years, in specific detail. The dates and incidents she had provided as reference material were every single conversation Daniel had described to me as evidence of my forgetting. Every approved expenditure I had no memory of authorizing, every meeting I had supposedly attended without retaining anything. They had been collecting these manufactured moments for 18 months, and now they were having them assembled into a written statement, in my own voice, formatted as a voluntary personal acknowledgement that I was no longer fit to make decisions about my own company. I read that document twice. I read every word, and I sat with it. I thought about the clinical patience it had taken to build something like this, to spend 1.5 years manufacturing incidents, documenting them, cataloging them, and then commission a professional writer to turn them into a confession in the target's own voice. This was not impulse. This was not opportunism. This was a plan that had been in place before Sandra ever sat down at my dinner table for the first time. Christine was crying openly now. She said, "Dad, the moment I understood what the document was actually for, I stopped writing. I told Sandra I had a conflict and could not finish the project. She never responded. She just went silent. And I spent 3 weeks terrified, trying to figure out what to do. Then I stopped being able to convince myself there was another explanation, and I picked up the phone. I reached across the table, and I took both of her hands in mine. I said, 'Christine, you did the right thing.' She shook her head and said, 'I should have called you the day I figured it out.' I said, 'You called me when you were ready. That is enough.' She wiped her face and said, 'Dad, what are you going to do?' I looked at her. I thought about Carol. I thought about the warehouse in Baltimore in 1983, the borrowed truck, what it had taken to get from that moment to this kitchen. I said, 'I am going to let them finish. I am going to let Sandra believe that everything she has built is about to pay off. And then I'm going to make sure that when it falls apart completely, in front of everyone, with no version of events that lets either of them walk away from what they have done.' I called Gordon Hess that same evening. Gordon was a 30-year FBI veteran in financial crimes, introduced to me through my brother Raymond, and who had already been helping me understand what Frank's forensic report meant in federal terms. When I told him about the document Sandra had commissioned, he went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of an experienced man when something shifts the scope of what he is looking at. He said, "Harold, that document changes the category of what we are dealing with. Financial fraud is serious. Coordinating the fabrication of a false incompetency record to support a conservatorship proceeding is a different set of statutes entirely." He said his contact at the Baltimore field office had been reviewing Frank's report and was ready to open a formal investigation. He said with Christine's email chain as additional evidence, they had enough to move. I told him I was going to arrange a family dinner. I told him I wanted Sandra to open the envelope herself at the table in front of Daniel, so there was no version of the moment that either of them could reframe or walk away from cleanly. Gordon said, "Harold, are you certain you want to be in the room when this happens? There are procedural ways to handle this that do not require you to sit across the table from your son." I said, "Gordon, I built that company for 41 years. I want to be in the room when it is protected." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I understand. We will be outside when you send the message." The dinner was Sandra's idea, and I made sure she knew I thought it was a beautiful one. I had called Daniel 2 weeks earlier on a Sunday afternoon and told him I had been doing a lot of thinking, that Sandra had been right, that carrying the company alone since Carol died had worn me down in ways I had not wanted to admit. I told him I was ready. I heard the relief move through him before he even spoke, the specific exhale of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and has just heard the handle turn. He said, "Dad, I am really glad you got there. Sandra's going to want to make it special." I said, "Daniel, whatever Sandra wants is fine with me. I just want it to feel like family." He said, "It will, Dad. I promise." Sandra called 2 days later. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Her voice was warm in the particular register she used when she wanted me to feel held. The warmth that by then I understood had been constructed over years. The way you construct anything else, carefully, with attention to detail, with a clear understanding of the effect you are trying to produce. She said, "Harold, I want this evening to be something you carry with you. I want it to feel like the moment it deserves to be, after everything you have given to this company and to this family." I told her that meant more than she knew. She said, "Just bring yourself. We will take care of everything else." I said I would bring the documents. There was a half-second of silence. Then she said, "Wonderful, Harold, just wonderful." And I could hear underneath those 2 words how long she had been holding them. The 3 weeks between that call and the evening of the dinner were the longest of the 4 months. I went to work every day, and I performed the patient, grateful retreat of a man who has accepted that his season is ending. I deferred to Daniel in meetings where 6 months ago I would have held the room. I asked Sandra's opinion on things I had already decided. I watched them become more comfortable, more certain, more fluid in their confidence. Every night I came home and sat at the kitchen table with Frank's report and Christine's email chain in front of me, going through everything one more time, not because I needed to, but because I needed to remember exactly why I was doing what I was doing. I arrived at Daniel and Sandra's house at 6 o'clock on a Saturday evening in April, with the manila envelope under my left arm and Lily's birthday present in my right hand, because her birthday was 4 days away, and I was not going to let what was about to happen at this table take anything away from a 7-year-old girl who deserved her gift from her grandfather, regardless of what her parents had chosen to become. I stood on the porch for a moment before I rang the bell. I thought about Carol. I thought about the specific way she used to squeeze my hand before a difficult negotiation and say, "Harold, you already know what to do." Then I rang the bell. Sandra opened the door before the sound had finished. Cream dress, perfect hair. She smiled at me with all of the warmth she had been practicing for 4 years, and she hugged me and held it a half-second too long the way she always did. She said, "Harold, you look wonderful. Come in. Come in. I've been looking forward to this all week." Daniel was in the living room, and he stood up and shook my hand with both of his, firm and warm, the handshake of a man trying to transmit something through his palms. He said, "Dad, I am really glad you are here tonight." I said, "I would not have missed it." I set the manila envelope on the chair beside me, and I watched Sandra's eyes go to it for exactly 2 seconds before she redirected her attention and smiled at something Daniel said. Lily came running in and climbed into my lap and showed me a drawing of a horse she had made at school. I told her it was the finest horse I had ever seen in my life. She laughed and climbed down, and I picked up my wine glass. And I waited. Sandra had spent real time on that dinner. The table was set with their good china, candles at the center. A bottle of wine meant to communicate the weight of the occasion. She brought out a butternut squash soup, perfectly seasoned, garnished with cream and fresh herbs. She told a story about a cooking class she had taken in the fall, and she looked at me while she told it with the eyes of a woman narrating the last comfortable evening of a long and careful plan. I ate the soup. I nodded. I asked about the recipe. I I watched Daniel across the table, cutting his bread, with the ease of a man who is 90 minutes away from getting everything he's been working toward. The main course was herb-roasted chicken with roasted root vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes. Sandra kept my wine glass filled throughout. She asked about the early years of the company. She asked what Carol had said on the evening Mercer Cold Chain crossed 10 million in annual revenue. I answered everything. I let my voice soften when I talked about Carol, because it genuinely softens when I talk about Carol, and I watched Sandra receive that softness and use it the way she always used whatever I gave her, as material. Halfway through the main course, Daniel reached under the table and squeezed Sandra's hand. She looked at him with an expression meant to communicate love, and I understood exactly what it actually communicated, that they were on schedule. After Sandra cleared the plates, she brought out an apple pie with vanilla ice cream and set it at the center of the table. She said, "Harold, I know this is your favorite. I wanted tonight to feel complete in every way." I said, "Sandra, you have outdone yourself. This whole evening has been extraordinary." She smiled and said, "It is the least you deserve." I cut a slice and I ate it. It was genuinely excellent, and I sat with the particular strangeness of that for a moment. The fact that someone could be legitimately talented at the small, beautiful things and entirely capable of the large, brutal ones, and that those two facts did not cancel each other out. They just existed together in the same person. Lily was excused from the table. The three of us sat in the candlelight with our wine glasses and the remains of the pie between us. Sandra folded her hands on the table, and she looked at me with an expression of such carefully assembled love that it almost deserved recognition as a performance in its own right. She said, "Harold, before Daniel shows you what we have prepared tonight, I just want to say something from my heart. I want you to know that everything we are doing, everything we have been working toward, comes from a genuine place of wanting you to be free. You have carried this company for 41 years. You have given it everything, and Daniel and I just want the rest of your life to be peaceful, to be light. You have earned that more than any man I have ever known." I looked at her while she said it. I looked at every word. Then I said, "Sandra, that is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me." Daniel cleared his throat, reached into the bag beside his chair, produced the leather portfolio, and set it on the table in front of me with both hands. He said, "Dad, our attorneys spent 2 months making sure this is structured exactly right. It transfers primary ownership and operational authority to me. You stay on as founder and senior advisor. You keep your salary and your title. Nothing changes. Except that the legal weight comes off your shoulders and you finally get to breathe." I picked up the portfolio. I opened it. I turned the pages slowly. I let them sit in that silence. I let the silence do its work. Sandra was very still across from me. Daniel had both hands flat on the table. I could see in their posture the specific tension of people who are very close to the end of something they have been building for a long time, and are trying not to show how much they want it to be over. I closed the portfolio. I set it down carefully on the table. I looked at Sandra. I looked at Daniel. And I said, "You know what? Before I put my name on anything tonight, I would like you both to take a look at what I brought with me." I reached to the chair beside me. I picked up the manila envelope, and I slid it across the table toward Sandra. She looked at it. She looked at Daniel. She picked it up. Her hands were steady, the way they were always steady. She opened the flap, reached inside, pulled out what was there, and I watched her face. The way you watch a building when you know what has been taken from its foundation. She was holding Frank Delgado's forensic report, 31 pages. Behind it was the summary document from the Baltimore field office, with her full legal name printed in the second paragraph, and a federal case number in the header. Behind that was Christine's email chain, printed in full, with Sandra's original brief attached at the end. The 4-page personal statement written in my voice, describing my own cognitive decline, with Sandra's email address at the top, and her instructions in her own words, requesting discretion, and describing the document as a surprise for Daniel. Sandra stopped at that last document. She stopped completely, and did not move for several seconds. The hands that were always steady were not steady anymore. She set the papers down on the table in front of her. She looked up at me, and the warmth was gone, completely, permanently. What was underneath it was the expression of someone who has just fully understood, for the first time, that the man across the table was never the man she had decided he was. Daniel grabbed the forensic report, read the first page, and I watched him go through the specific sequence of disbelief and recognition and panic that I had imagined watching him go through for 4 months. He said, "Dad," and then he stopped, because there was nothing he could put after that word that was going to help him. Sandra said, "Harold, please, these things have explanations. You have to let us explain. You are misunderstanding what you are looking at." I said, "Sandra, you sent my daughter a professional brief, asking her to write a false statement of cognitive decline in my own voice, to use in a conservatorship proceeding. I have the email. I have the brief. I have your instructions. In your own words, I would very much like to hear the explanation for that." I took my phone from my jacket pocket. I sent a single text message, 2 words, "We're ready." I set the phone face up on the table between us. Sandra looked at the screen. She looked at the door. She looked at me. And for the first time since I had known her, there was nothing between us but the truth of what she had done, and the absolute understanding that it had not worked. Daniel stood up so fast his chair caught the edge of the rug and nearly went over. He said, "Dad, what have you done?" I said, "Daniel, I did what I should have done the morning you described a conversation that never happened and looked me in the eye while you did it. I protected what I built." The doorbell rang 30 seconds later. Gordon Hess was at the front door in his grey coat. Agents at the back entrance. The dining room where Sandra had served her perfect apple pie and her perfect performance was full of the specific sound of consequences that had been a long time coming and were now exactly on time. I walked to the living room. I sat on the couch next to Lily. I watched her draw. She leaned into my arm without looking up from her paper. In the dining room behind me, the agents were doing their work. Sandra was crying. Real tears. The first completely unperformed thing I had seen from her in 4 years. Daniel was talking in the low, urgent voice of a man trying to find a version of events that still makes sense. I sat with my granddaughter. I watched her draw her horses and her houses and her careful 7-year-old version of the world, and I thought about Carol and about everything it had cost to be sitting in this room tonight, with everything I had built still intact. Mercer Cold Chain had 92 trucks on the road. Every contract was still in my name. Every driver still had a job. Everything I had built from a single borrowed truck. And $1,200, and an absolute refusal to stop, was still exactly where I had put it. I had become very good at smiling, but tonight, for the first time in 4 months, the smile was real.